Hello everybody, all those cool cats and kittens out there. So today is the last day of the Metamorphosis. Can you believe it? We've been reading this story for about 3-4 kind of weeks now. If we were in class together, we wouldn't have taken quite this long to read it. But you know what, sometimes when things change, you have to adjust your plans. And all of you have done a wonderful job at doing that. As I am putting in the grades, I'm just so pleased with everybody. And just the way that you all have adapted to this situation and done a great job switching to the virtual classroom. All right, so today we are going to read the last section of the Metamorphosis, and then you are going to complete a final quiz, and then we're going to do some reflection writing with it, and then we're just going to kind of move on. The last day of school is the 29th, right? So let's take a look here. It will be here before we know it. I don't know why my calendar. Okay. So the 29th, so we have this week, we have next week, and then our last week of school, okay? So keep that in mind as you are getting to the end of this year. Make sure that your grades are all in a good spot. Remember, if you didn't do so well in quarter 3, making sure to do as much as you can with this virtual stuff in quarter 4 can help average out that grade to give you that passing good semester grade. Okay, because remember, the semester grade is what counts. English is broken into 2 semesters, right? So you have your first semester and your second semester. If you failed first semester, you will have to repeat English 2 semester 1, maybe through ELP or by retaking the class somewhere down the line. And then if you fail semester 2, you could have to retake English 2 semester 2. Right, and of course, we are going to work together, all of you who are having issues, technology, Wi-Fi, all of those things. We're going to work together to make sure that you had the best opportunity you could to be successful. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and take a moment and review what we have read so far in our story. So remember, we got Gregor Samsa, his dad, his mom, and his sister Greta, right? Those are our main characters. And this family, before Gregor transformed into this vermin, relied on him, right? They relied on him for financial support. And we learn through background and context that something happened with his father's business. But then this happens, and through Gregor's stressing, we realize he was pretty unhappy with his job, right? But now he is unhappy being a vermin because his family is disgusted by him, right? But his sister Greta, he seems to have a very special relationship with. She takes the time to take care of him, bring him food, but now she has had to go back to work, right? She's working in sales, so she's paying less attention to Gregor, and so is his mother and his father. Right, so Gregor seems like he's just sort of been locked up in his room for weeks and weeks and weeks now. He's heavily injured, right, because the few times that he has come out, his family, his father in particular, right, has shoved him back in his room. He has an apple lodged in his back, right? He scraped his stomach on that first morning. And he doesn't seem to be doing too well, right? He's sickly. He's not eating anything. We saw 3 new characters come into the scene just with day 9. And we have 3 men. It seems like the middle man is our leader of the group. They're kind of picky, right, it seems. And they like everything to be clean. And then at the end of the last section that we read, we figure out that our 3 men are going to move out, and they are refusing to pay the family because now They're disgusted by how dirty the place is. It seems like maybe they're using it as an excuse not to pay, right? Whenever the middleman announced that, he kind of looked at his two friends and they jumped on board, right? The family wants to move out, but they can't because they are scared to transport Gregor, even though he knows that it would really be very simple. It seems like maybe the family just doesn't want to leave. All right, so that brings us to where we are now with day 10. So let's go ahead and get into our reading. All right, so we're going to start here where our middleman is declaring that he is going to leave these repugnant conditions, right? These repulsive is a good way to think of that word, conditions. And then we are going to listen through to the end. You can see I'm going to let the other guy read for me today. I think that his voice is just a little bit nicer than mine when I listen to it. So I hope you guys like him as well.
And glancing at Gregor's mother and sister to gain their attention too, that with regard to the repugnant conditions that prevail in this flat and with this family, here he looked briefly but decisively at the floor, I give immediate notice on my room. For the days that I have been living here I will of course pay nothing at all. On the contrary, I will consider whether to proceed with some kind of action for damages from you, and believe me, it would be very easy to set out the grounds for such an action. He was silent, and looked straight ahead as if waiting for something, and indeed his two friends joined in with the words, "And we also give immediate notice." With that, he took hold of the door handle and slammed the door.
I'm just going to Let's continue. Sorry for that little interruption, but I wanted to make sure that the audio was coming through good.
Gregor's father staggered back to his seat, feeling his way with his hands, and fell into it. It looked as if he was stretching himself out for his usual evening nap, but from the uncontrolled way his head kept nodding, it could be seen that he was not sleeping at all. Throughout all this, Gregor had lain still where the three gentlemen had first seen him. His disappointment at the failures of his plan, and perhaps also because he was weak from hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He was sure that everyone would turn on him any moment, and he waited. He was not even startled out of this state when the violin on his mother's lap fell from her trembling fingers and landed loudly on the floor. "Father, Mother," said his sister, hitting the table with her hand as introduction, "we can't carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone can accuse us of doing anything wrong." "She's absolutely right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who had still not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held out in front of her and a deranged expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister rushed to his mother and put her hand on her forehead. Her words seemed to give Gregor's father some more definite ideas. He sat upright, played with his uniform cap between the plates left by the three gentlemen after their meal, and occasionally looked down at Gregor as he lay there immobile. "We have to try and get rid of it," said Gregor's sister, now speaking only to her father, as her mother was too occupied with coughing to listen. "It'll be the death of both of you. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to, and then come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it. I can't endure it any more." And she broke out so heavily in tears that they flowed down the face of her mother, and she wiped them away with mechanical hand movements. "My child," said her father with sympathy and obvious understanding, "what are we to do?" His sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness and tears that had taken hold of her, displacing her earlier certainty. "If he could just understand us," said his father.
Do you hear the way that Gregor's sister has changed how she's talking about Gregor, right? she said, we have to get rid of it, right? Think of that word it. They're not even calling him anymore, or my brother. She said, we cannot continue to be tortured. We can't endure it, right? It's going to be the death of you. So what do those words tell us about how they're feeling about Gregor while he's sort of lying there, motionless, too weak? So let's see what happens.
Almost as a question, his sister shook her hand vigorously through her tears as a sign that of that there was no question. If he could just understand us, repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty that it was quite impossible, then perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement with him. But as it is... It's got to go, shouted his sister. That's the only way, father. You've got to get rid of the idea that it's Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have gone of his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother any more then, but we could carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. As it is, this animal is persecuting us. It's driven out our tenants. It obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the streets. Father, look, just look, she suddenly screamed. He's starting again. In her alarm, which was totally beyond Gregor's comprehension, his sister even abandoned his mother as she pushed herself vigorously out of her chair, as if more willing to sacrifice her own mother than to stay anywhere near Gregor. She rushed over to behind her father, who had become excited merely because she was, and stood up, half raising his hands in front of Gregor's sister as if to protect her. But Gregor had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn around so that he could go back to his room, although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-racked condition meant that turning round required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself do it, repeatedly raising it and striking it against the floor. He stopped and looked around. They seemed to have realized his good intentions and had only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed with exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father with her arms around his neck. Maybe now they'll let me turn around, thought Greta.
So it seems like Greta has not just physically, right, moved to her father's side. She's gone over to him, left his mother, but also sort of emotionally towards Gregor. Gregor's father has been pretty distant this whole time towards him, whereas Greta and his mother were kind of still trying to see Gregor through all of this hardship and difficulties. But now his sister has physically moved away from his mother and gone to her father's side, okay? So that's the author trying to tell us something there, right? Franz Kafka is doing something sort of underlying in the text here to show us a shift in Greta, right? So this is an author's choice, a strategy that he is using in this story to sort of let us understand where Greta is coming from now. Let's continue.
Gregor went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the effort, and had sometimes to stop and take a rest. No one was making him rush any more. Everything was left up to him. As soon as he had finally finished turning round, he began to move straight ahead. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and could not understand how he had covered that distance in his weak state a little before, and almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not any cry from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way round as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but it was none the less enough to see that nothing behind him had changed. Only his sister had stood up. With his last glance, he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut, bolted and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there waiting and sprung forwards lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all, and as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last!" "What now, then?" Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker, and would finally disappear altogether. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back, or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. He thought back of his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away, even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. When the cleaner came in the morning, they'd often asked her not to keep slamming the doors, but with her strength and in her hurry she still did, so that everyone in the flat knew when she had arrived, and from then on it was impossible to sleep in peace. She made her usual brief look in on Gregor, and at first found nothing special. She thought he was laying there so still on purpose.
So what has happened to Gregor here? Right? He's laying there with the decayed apple on his back and sort of very hurt. And he remembers how much he loves his family, right? And he realizes that he has to leave them for them to be happy. So what did he do? All right.
Playing the martyr, she attributed all possible understanding to him. She happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, so she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When she had no success with that, she tried to make a nuisance of herself and poked at him a little. Only when she found she could shove him across the floor with no resistance at all did she start to pay attention. She soon realized what had really happened, opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but did not waste time to yank open the bedroom doors and shout loudly into the darkness of the bedrooms, "Come and have a look at this! It's dead! Just lying there, stone dead!" Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat upright there in their marriage bed, and had to make an effort to get over the shock caused by the cleaner before they could grasp what she was saying. But then, each from his own side, they hurried out of bed. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa just came out in her nightdress, and that is how they went to Gregor's room. On the way, they opened the door to the living room, where Greta had been sleeping since the 3 gentlemen had moved in. She was fully dressed as if she had never been asleep, and the paleness of her face seemed to confirm this. "Dead?" asked Mrs. Samsa, looking at the charwoman inquiringly, even though she could have checked for herself, and could have known it even without checking. "That's what I said," replied the cleaner, and to prove it, she gave Gregor's body another shove with the broom, sending it sideways across the floor. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as if she wanted to hold back the broom, but did not complete it. "Now then," said Mr. Samsa, "let's give thanks to God for that." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. Greta, who had not taken her eyes from the corpse, said, "Just look how thin he was. He didn't eat anything for so long. The food came out again just the same as when it went in." Gregor's body was indeed completely dried up and flat. They had not seen it until then, but now he was not lifted up on his little legs, nor did he do anything to make them look away. "Greta, come with us in here for a little while," said Mrs. Samsa with a pained smile, and Greta followed her parents into the bedroom, but not without looking back at the body. The cleaner shut the door and opened the window wide. Although it was still early in the morning, the fresh air had something of warmth mixed in with it. It was already the end of March, after all. The 3 gentlemen stepped out of their room and looked round in amazement for their breakfasts. They had been forgotten about. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle gentleman asked the cleaner irritably. She just put her finger on her lips and made a quick and silent sign to the men that they might like to come into Gregor's room. They did so, and stood around Gregor's corpse with their hands in the pockets of their well-worn coats. It was now quite light in the room. Then the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All of them had been crying a little. Greta now and then pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home now," said Mr. Samsa, indicating the door, and without letting the women from him. "What do you mean?" asked the middle of the three gentlemen, somewhat disconcerted, and he smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs, and continually rubbed them together in gleeful anticipation of a loud quarrel, which could only end in their favour. "I mean just what I said," answered Mr. Samsa, and, with his two companions, went in a straight line towards the man. At first he stood there still, looking at the ground as if the contents of his head were rearranging themselves into new positions. "All right, we'll go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa as if he had been suddenly overcome with humility and wanted permission again from Mr. Samsa for his decision. Mr. Samsa merely opened his eyes wide and briefly nodded to him several times. At that, and without delay, the man actually did take long strides into the front hallway. His two friends had stopped rubbing their hands some time before and had been listening to what was being said. Now they jumped off after their friend, as if taken with a sudden fear that Mr. Samsa might go into the hallway in front of them and break the connection with their leader. Once there, all three took their hats from the stand, took their sticks from the holder, bowed without a word, and left the premises. Mr. Samsa and the two women followed them out onto the landing, but they had no reason to mistrust the men's intentions, and as they leaned over the landing they saw how the three gentlemen made slow but steady progress down the many steps. As they turned the corner on each floor, they disappeared, and would reappear a few moments later. The further down they went, the more that the Samsa family lost interest in them. When a butcher's boy, proud of posture with his tray on his head, passed them on his way up and came nearer than they were, Mr. Samsa and the women came away from the landing and went, as if relieved, back into the flat. They decided the best way to make use of that day was for relaxation and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it. So they sat at the table and wrote 3 letters of excusal, Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractor, and Greta to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing to tell them she was going. She'd finished her work for that morning. The 3 of them at first just nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only when the cleaner still did not seem to want to leave that they looked up in irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood in the doorway with a smile on her face, as if she had some tremendous good news to report, but would only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. Samsa all the time she had been working for them, swayed gently in all directions. "What is it you want, then?" asked Mr. Samsa, whom the cleaner had the most respect for. "Yes," she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak straight away. "Well then, that thing in there, you needn't worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down over their letters as if intent on continuing with what they were doing. Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but with outstretched hand he made it quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was prevented from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and, clearly peeved, called out, "Cheerio then, everyone," turned round sharply, and left, slamming the door terribly as she went. "Tonight she gets sacked," said Mr. Samsa, but he had received no reply from either his wife or his daughter, as the charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window, where they remained with their arms around each other. Mr. Samsa twisted round in his chair to look at them, and sat there watching for a while. Then he called out, "Come here, then. Let's forget about all that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention." The 2 women immediately did as he said, hurrying over to him where they kissed him and hugged him, and then they quickly finished their letters. After that, the 3 of them left the flat together, which was something they had not done for months, and took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram filled with warm sunshine all to themselves. Leant back comfortably on their seats, they discussed their prospects and found that on closer examination they were not all that bad. Until then, they had never asked each other about their work, but all three had jobs which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location, and most of all, more practical. All the time, Greta was becoming livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck, almost simultaneously, with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter. Just from each other's glance, and almost without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And, as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, Greta was the first to get up and stretch out her young body.
All right, so that is the end of our story. Can you believe it? So, Gregor, at the end, died, right? And this death seemed almost intentional. It came at it. I mean, he had been slowly decaying for a while, right, by being injured by his family. But it seemed the way that he laid down and he had this sort of very peaceful moment where he thought about his family lovingly. And then he just sort of died, right? And then we have our charwoman who came in and announced it. And then here in this last paragraph, we find some hope, right, for our family. It seems that they have been going through a lot of turmoil and stress, but now they are moving forward, right? But on the other hand, we do have a family who doesn't seem to be mourning for, their son and their brother very much. So that is something to kind of reflect on and think about. I don't think that the intention here from Franz Kafka was to make this negative, right? Not for us to think badly about the family, but to just realize that maybe everything comes in at a time, right? And there's a certain amount of acceptance that we have to have. So think about that, and then make sure that you complete the quiz for today, and you will have today, the weekend, and then I'm also going to give you Monday, because I know this is a longer video, a longer chunk of the reading. So if you want, take your time with it, right? Go back and make sure that you answer the questions to your best of your ability. My recommendation is to have the reading open it as you are listening, and then also keep it open while you complete the quiz, right? That'll help you so you can go back and look and remember. All right, guys, have a wonderful, wonderful day. Have a great weekend, and I will be back soon with another video.